We've got courts full of judges and judges full of judicial philosophies, but we're talking about a bunch of old lawyers wearing funny costumes that I didn't even get to vote for. Are we sure that they're all that relevant to my life? Well, that's a hard yes. The courts might be the most underrated branch of government when it comes to how much influence they have on your everyday life. While Congress is coming up with laws with a lot of fancy language you and I might never read, the courts help us figure out how federal law actually works IRL using, well, still fancy language. Now this is where we get to dive into the most exciting part, the federal court system in action. It's time to talk about what kinds of stuff the courts get to decide and why it all matters to you. Think about it this way. Because lawmaking power is divided up between states and the federal government, it's not often that a single law changes everyone's lives at once. When you vote, you can be voting about issues like what kind of taxes you pay or how much money we invest in schools, but often we vote to express our values about what kind of country or city or state we want to live in. We vote to say collectively what kinds of priorities do we want our society to focus on. While our elected officials build our world through laws, that often happens state by state and city by city, but when you vote, you might be thinking a lot bigger than that. Those big deal questions are answered not just in how the laws get written, but also how the laws get interpreted, and that's what the courts exist to do. Take Brown v. Board of Education. That's the Supreme Court case about school segregation that you might have heard of before. It decided that racial segregation of schools, based on the idea that black schools and white schools were separate but equal, wasn't actually equal at all. The court ruled that to make sure that all students got access to the same education, they needed to have access to the same schools. The Brown case looked at existing law, in this case, the part of the 14th Amendment that says that all US citizens have the right to equal protection of the law, and found that the government has to apply its laws to everyone equally, no matter who they are. The court's job in Brown was to compare the different ways the 14th Amendment was being interpreted by the Board of Education of Topeka, 13 elementary school parents in Kansas, and all sorts of other groups like the NAACP and the Department of Justice who wrote to the court. And using all that information, the court had to figure out what equal actually looked like. They took the value of equality that we have in our heads and figured out how it walks and talks and where it can go to school. And not just for one school district, for the entire country at once. That's probably the coolest thing about the federal court system. At its highest level, the court can make a landmark decision that puts our country's values in action and changes what everyday life looks like for all of us at the same time. The court did the same thing pretty recently in a case called Obergefell v. Hodges. They interpreted the 14th Amendment to say that equal meant that the legal rights of marriage needed to include same-sex couples too. But the court's interpretation doesn't always move in the same direction. Sure, in Brown and Obergefell, their interpretation of the 14th Amendment got broader and broader. But in Shelby County v. Holder, it got narrower. In 2013, Shelby County, Alabama sued then Attorney General Eric Holder over part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The part that said that any new change in voting laws in certain states had to be approved by the Department of Justice, because those states, including Alabama, had a history of voter discrimination, and the Department of Justice wanted to make sure they weren't trying to make voting harder for people based on their race. Shelby County argued that between 1965 and 2013, the world had changed enough that we didn't need to worry about whether some states would try to make voting unequal anymore, and that it wasn't fair to review the laws of some states and not others and get in the way of how states chose to run their elections. The majority of the Supreme Court justices agreed with Shelby County and struck down that part of the Voting Rights Act. The 14th Amendment got narrower in that case. As it turns out, a whole bunch of voting rights restrictions in Alabama and other states followed not long after. So the courts are important because big things in your life that might matter to you, where you can go to school, who you can marry, whether or not you get to vote, are all things that courts have the power to change. But I also think it's important to point out that the changes the court makes aren't always worthy of a push notification. They also work in smaller ways that can affect your everyday life. Like, we've all taken sides in the great tomato debate by now, right? All those times I mentioned mentioned that the Supreme Court has the power to decide whether tomatoes are a fruit or a vegetable, that was a real case in 1893. In Nix v. Hayden, the Supreme Court was asked to decide whether tomatoes counted as fruits because fruit and vegetable imports were taxed at different rates. The court decided that tomatoes were vegetables and they had to be taxed as such, a decision which may still be affecting your grocery bill today. And it's not just the Supreme Court that can have an impact on you either. Plenty of cases end in the district courts or in the Court of Appeals, so the lower courts get the last word on interpreting the law. Like Glick v. Cuniff. You might not have heard of this case, but you probably have heard about what it decided. In 2011, the First Circuit Court of Appeals decided that it's your right to record public officials when they're out in public. It's the reason you're allowed to take video of police on your phone. And while the case never went to the Supreme Court, it's been cited across the country by other appellate courts who agreed with the First Circuit. Because court decisions help our government figure out what to actually do with the law, they can be the first to open the floodgates of justice or the last line of defense in laws that we think are unjust. Like when President Trump issued an executive order restricting citizens of 6 majority Muslim countries in 2017 from traveling to the US, several states sued to stop the order from going into effect. It was the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals who issued a temporary restraining order on the ban so that people from those 6 countries could keep entering the US. They said that the ban violated the part of the First Amendment that says that the government can't prevent people from practicing a specific religion. The Supreme Court eventually decided to take up the case, so we don't know how the executive order will shake out quite yet. But if you were one of those people with a sign at an airport, the Court of Appeals came through for you. If you've ever thought to yourself, hey, I think this law is wrong or unfair and I don't know what to do about it, the federal court system is one way to change it. And it turns out you can change what the court system looks like too. We'll talk about how the heck you can make a difference in who and what goes into the courts next time.